Hey, hello, welcome to the ASSA sponsored session on polarization experiments. We have 4 papers in the panel today. The talks will be 20 minutes each, and after each one, the discussant will present for 5 minutes. We'll then have about 20 minutes at the end for an open Q&A for all of the papers. So our first speaker is Chen, who will present the role of group identity in fostering political polarization, which will be discussed by Roy Levy. Then Eugene Demont will present strategic behavior with tight and loose norms with discussant Laura G. I will present polarization and group cooperation with discussant Catherine Eckel, and Michael Thaler will present the supply of motivated beliefs with discussant Cesar Martidelli. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we're particularly grateful to our excellent discussants for their contribution to our session. So Yen, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Andrea, for organizing the session, and thanks everyone for coming. So I'm going to present a joint paper with Kevin Bauer, Florian Hett, and Michael Kosfeld. And we will discuss the idea of group identity, the role of group identity in polarization. So since this is the polarization session, I'm just going to talk about, in the United States and also in some countries in Europe, we see not just policy polarization, the differential across policy, but also affective polarization in the sense that people just don't like those from the other side of the political spectrum. And our goal in this paper is to look at the cognitive processes behind polarization. So we look at how group identity affect belief formation, and we will measure prior beliefs, information demand, processing, and posterior. This paper has sort of the measurement and classification part as well as an intervention. So we collected 3 waves of data on Prolific, an online platform. So the first wave was conducted the week before the 2020 presidential election, where we measure group identity, political leaning, and incentivize our participants to predict some policy relevant statistics conditional on who wins the election. So the specific statistics are unemployment rate in September 2021, so a year from the time of the experiment almost, and also the public health ranking of the United States, again, in 2021. The second wave was conducted after the inauguration, so at the end of January, and the last wave was conducted in November 2021, so after the statistics were realized. So the subsequent waves were essentially, I'm not going to have time to talk about it, but look at the cognitive processes in more depth, and also to paid subjects. So let me present the first wave. We had 1,000 participants on Prolific, and the experiment was pre-registered. So in this wave, we have several stages. We first measure the participants' groupiness, if you will. So we conducted the minimum group paradigm, and using the other allocation games where participants are randomly assigned to minimum groups, and we measure their in-group favoritism or minimum groupiness, and then we measure their political affiliation and conducted a number of surveys before they move on to the political group. So other allocation games in the political context, where we measure their co-partisan favoritism, and we also call this political groupiness. So just to, many people are familiar with this framework. So we randomly assign people to circle or triangle groups, and they divide $6 between a person from the circle group versus someone from the triangle group, and also if both are from the circle and both are from the triangle group. So this measures, if you will, someone's tendency to make sense of the world by group affiliation. So we think of this as something like, risk preferences. And they go through a political identity survey. So for independents, I just want to clarify, we further press them, are you leaning Democrat or Republican? So everybody is putting one of these 2 camps. We also went through the political polarization questions. So these are factual questions that systematically exhibit a partisan gap in terms of the answers. So these are questions adopted from Peterson and Iyengar. And then they go through this co-partisan favoritism measure or political groupiness. So now they are allocating $6 between a member of the Democratic group, so including Democrats and Democrat-leaning independents versus someone from the Republican group, or both from the Democrats and both from Republicans groups. So then we elicit their prior for policy relevant questions. So one is on unemployment rate. If Biden, or Trump wins, what will be the unemployment rate in September 2021? So this is a hard task. And we tell them the statistics in September 2020. We also ask them what will be the U.S. News and World Report's public health system ranking of the United States in September 2021. We tell them that the United States ranked number 15 in September 2020 and Canada ranked number 1. So this creates essentially a need for information from the other side, given that our participants tend to consume news from in-group media. So we curated articles on the candidates' policies from left, right, or neutral media sources. We select paragraphs from these sources and synthesize them so that they cover the same facts, but with different slants. We also make sure that they have the same length, format, and transitions. So now I'm going to go through the two main stages. One is for information demand, the other one is for information processing. These two stages are the orders randomized. So I'm just going to call them stage D and stage P. So they see two article titles on the economy or the health, and the experimental manipulation here is either with or without labels of the news sources. And we elicit their willingness to pay to read one of the articles. They start with 50% probability of reading either, and they have an endowment of $3 that they can use to move the probabilities of reading each article. So this is what the interface look like. So this is the experimental condition where they see the source. And so you might not be able to see very well. Here's a slider at 50-50, and they can expend their resources, their endowments, to move the slider, to change the probability of reading each article. In the information processing stage, they see two articles on consecutive screens. One is from the left-leaning, the other one is from the right-leaning news media. And the experimental manipulation is, again, either with or without labels. After they consume, after they actually read. So here in the information processing stage, they have to read both articles, and then we ask them to update their posterior. So here's the information processing stage, and this is the case where they see the label, right? And in the treatment, we remove the labels, but the teaser and the title remain the same. So let me present the main results. So first we go through the classification. So they went through two other allocation games. So these are non-strategic games, and this is also a game that prior research in a meta-analysis have shown to have fairly robust results in terms of measuring people's intergroup preferences. And so what you see here, so let me first define groupiness, because it's not a term. It's a term that was first used by Crenton and co-authors in 2017. So groupiness is defined as someone allocating more than 50% of the tokens to in-group participants. So what you see here is the allocation. So this is the dollar assigned to in-group member, to the in-group member. Notice that they can assign at most $5, not the entire $6 to the in-group member. So the gray bar indicates someone from the minimum groups in the minimum group allocation, and the dark one are political groups. So if you allocate $1 or $2 or $3, so 3 is the equal split across the two other participants, you're defined as non-groupie. And if you allocate $4 or $5 to your in-group members, they're defined as groupie. They're classified as groupie. So what you see here is, first of all, in the minimum group allocations, 37% of our participants are groupie. So this is consistent with many other experiments using college students, which is about a third of the participants tend to be groupie. The other one is that the proportion of groupie participants is much higher in the political context, so it's 59%. We also see that they're more extreme. There are more people assigning, the maximum possible to in-group members. We also find that someone's groupiness is highly correlated across contexts. So, in fact, 80% of the minimally groupie participants are also politically groupie. So we speculate or conjecture in this paper that groupiness is a trait or a cognitive shortcut that people use to make sense of the world. And so this is a condensed version of the regression table, which shows, so if you want to predict who are the politically groupie people. And so this cobweb looks at, we normalize various measures, the battery of measurements that we conducted from 0 to 1. And the solid line represent politically groupie participants, and the dashed line are minimally groupie, non-groupie participants. So the most significant predictor of being politically groupie is to be minimally groupie. So share of minimum groupie individuals. And they correlate with a whole host of other survey measures, which is the regular consumption of in-group media. They're less likely to consume out-group media. They have stronger partisan identification, and they're more likely to give incorrect but party congenial answers to factual questions. So it is meaningful. It is a meaningful measure outside of the experiment. And then we look at the predictions, the cognitive measures. So first of all, we observed that in their prior predictions, before they even consume, before they demand for or consume various media resources, they show in-group bias in their prior predictions, and this in-group bias is stronger for co-partisan favoring or we say politically groupie participants. The other result is to look at information demand. And what we see in our experiment is information avoidance. So they're always choosing between in-group versus neutral, and also between out-group versus neutral. So what we see is that co-partisan favoring individuals or politically groupie individuals are significantly more likely to avoid out-group and demand in-group news. So the information avoidance part, when choosing in-group, out-group versus neutral, is statistically significant. So this is essentially the paper has two sets of analysis. One is, are they more likely to spend resources to demand in-group news, or are they more likely to spend resources to avoid out-group news? we find that overall, we find that people are willing to expend resources to avoid outgroup news, but this effect is stronger for politically groupy participants. What about information processing? We find that politically groupy or co-partisan favoring individuals are more likely to process information in in-group biased way. So you start with biased priors, and it becomes exacerbated after the information processing stage. So now we're looking at information demand. So this is just a reminder, the manipulation is whether you show the label or not, the sources or not. So we call this manipulation delabeling. Oh, I'm sorry. Right, so this slide is a bit out of context, but what we did at the end of the experiment is we measured their information processing in a neutral context. That is, they were giving them 2 urns, each is drawn with 50% probability, and we give them an informative signal and ask, which urn is the marble from? So this is a completely neutral context. And so you see that I'll come back to this, that Democrats and Republicans, then groupie versus non-groupie individuals are different in terms of information demand and processing. What about a neutral context? Do they process neutral information differently? So this is the treatment effect. So when we label versus delabel the information sources, what happens to information demand? We find that when we delabel information sources, it significantly reduces outgroup information avoidance by about 7 percentage points. And this is primarily driven by politically groupie participants. And then we look at information processing. So there is no treatment effect in information processing. So the treatment effect, this basically shows that it is primarily driven by politically groupie individuals. So now I'm going to actually, before doing this, is to go back to the urns experiment. So we measure people's tendency to, in a completely neutral context, we look at how they process information and how they handle signals, informative signals. We find that groupie and non-groupie individuals are the same in terms of their likelihood to guess the urn correctly, and also consistency with Bayesian updating. And we also look at Republicans and Democrats. It turns out that they're within 1 percentage points of each other in terms of the likelihood of being consistent with Bayesian information processing. So in the neutral context, there is actually no difference between groupie versus non-groupie individuals versus, and also Democrats and Republicans. So it seems that the label itself produces, increases the salience of partisan identity. And so let me just wrap up. So what we did was to measure groupiness in the minimum and political context. And then I don't have time to talk about it today, but we also repeat the measurements in the second and the third wave. And the intervention, so first of all, we show that they're highly correlated in terms of if you go through the predictive paradigm, minimum groupiness is the strongest predictor of political groupiness. And so in terms of intervention, when we delabel news sources, we find that it decreases, what it does is that it decreases the salience of partisan identities, and it decreases the outgroup information avoidance, which is completely driven by the political groupie participants. And the policy implication for this, one is if you want to increase policy uptakes, one possibility is to make the political identity less salient. So one example is the Enroll American paper by Lehman et al., where they look at enrollment in the Affordable Care sort of government-sponsored insurance program by the Affordable Care Act. They randomize people into the government-run versus private-run websites. In the private-run websites, they emphasize the market, aspect of the insurance program, and find that it significantly increases Republicans' enrollment. The other part that came out of this research program is to say that Group E participants actually do not have information avoidance of neutral media. So if we think about science, nature, what we used for neutral media sources, they are actually doing well. So one potential policy implication is to play up the communication channels from these neutral media sources, and perhaps to use natural language processing techniques to mix news from diverse sources. So I'm finished. Thank you. So I think Roy is the discussant, right? So let me stop sharing.
Share my screen. Okay, can you all see the screen and hear me?
Yes.
Great, let's begin. So thanks so much, Chen. I really enjoyed this paper. It does so much. Measures political groupiness. It estimates demand for like-minded news. It tests how beliefs are updated after consuming biased news. And it does these two while also randomizing the labels. So I'm not going to discuss the labels today just because I won't have time. But that just shows you how much this one experiment is able to accomplish. And what I really like is that it bridges these two literatures, the social psychology literature on in-group preferences and this political economy literature on effective polarization and selective exposure. So I want to discuss kind of 1 minute on each result. I'll kind of try to explain what I think is the main contribution and maybe potential concerns or future research ideas, and then discuss the big picture if I have time left. So the first thing that Jan and her co-authors show is that minimal groupiness is strongly associated with political groupiness. And since the definition was really clear in the presentation, I want to repeat it, but I just want to explain how important this is. So I think we have a lot of good evidence that partisan disdain is increasing, effective polarization is increasing. There's more and more political in-group preferences. And what this paper shows is that this preference could be related to some fundamental trait, to this what the authors call minimal groupiness trait. And that can help us understand it better and know kind of why it increases, why it decreases, who is more likely to suffer from it, and so forth. Some thoughts I had while reading the paper is, first of all, why is there any groupiness in this minimal setting? And this isn't a complaint to the author because this has been already established in previous papers, but it is something that I think will help us understand this groupiness trait. The groups are allocated randomly. The participants know that they were randomly allocated to the circle or triangle group. They don't have any chance to communicate, in contrast to some previous papers. So it's really not clear why in this setting people still prefer the circle group over the triangle group. And then my second part, and this is really minor, but I still think it's worth thinking about, is whether there's any anchoring going on. So if I'm a participant, and I already said that I prefer the circle group over the triangle group, it's pretty likely that I will now say, well, if I prefer circles over triangles, I also prefer Democrats over Republicans, or vice versa. But that's the minor comments. I think kind of the next step forward is understanding what is the mechanism tying political groupiness and minimal groupiness. And just kind of to speculate, maybe minimal groupiness is related to some, very basic tribalism trait. And then political groupiness depends on the specific individual's dominant tribe. For some people, it's, the partisan affiliation. For others, it's the ethnicity, the race, the nationality, or something else. So that's in terms of groupiness. Then the second result is that participants are willing to give up money to read article from a like-minded source, or more specifically to read article from a neutral source over an opposing source. And here I really like the methodology. I thought this was a super clever way to elicit preferences, that people pay an additional $1 to increase the likelihood of receiving the source that they prefer. And I think the contribution here is showing, providing direct evidence that consumers receive this utility from opposing news. I had two thoughts in this context. One is that I did not completely understand how we can separate the avoidance from an opposing news source versus a preference for a neutral news source, so to speak. Right? These two options are pitted against each other. There's no outside option of not getting any news source. So the terminology of avoidance versus preference confused me a bit. My second thought is, I'm wondering whether this preference for neutral news source over opposing or like-minded over neutral is due to some direct utility. People just enjoy reading the news more, or due to its perceived accuracy. And there's a lot of theoretical literature about this, but very little empirical evidence. And actually, I think the authors can test that in this setting, because then in the news processing segment, they can test what happens when people randomly read different news sources and see if people update their beliefs differently when they receive like-minded versus opposing news, which one leads to more updating. Maybe people choose like-minded news because they know that this will have a greater likelihood of updating their beliefs. Finally, let's discuss news processing. Here, the authors find substantial heterogeneity in updating beliefs. So participants read news from the same sources. And what they find is that the political groupie participants are more likely to diverge in their opinions. That is, the partisan gap between Democrats and Republicans grows even when they read the exact same news sources. And I think this contributes to a whole literature on why people's beliefs don't converge when they read news from the same source. Theoretically, we would expect them to converge, but that does not happen. And the contribution here is, maybe there's some really important heterogeneity. Maybe for some people, beliefs do converge, and for others, beliefs actually diverge. And for that, we need to know the political groupiness of the individual. So here, I think this heterogeneity is super important. I also have some thoughts about the labels, and I think that also makes a big contribution. I just don't have time to discuss it, so I'll send an email to the authors later. But I'm just wondering here whether it's political groupiness per se, or whether there could be some correlated variables, such as how extreme people are, that is driving this heterogeneity. So let me just conclude with one big picture comment. So this paper answers many questions, which I found really interesting. I think it would have been helpful if there was one big research question that ties all of these sub-questions together. One potential suggestion, and I know that this might not be useful, but just a thought, is that maybe you can think of this paper as decomposing the gap in persuasion. How much is it due to preferring like-minded sources? How much is it due to how people process news sources conditional on their preference? And how much is due to this initial groupiness? And if you can separate those three components, that could be interesting, in my opinion. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Roy.
All right, so I'm going to take over. Thanks so much for having me. So this is brand new work. It's the first time I'm presenting, so bear with me. This is joined with Michelle Gelfand, Anna Hochleitner, and Silvia Sonderegger, who's in the audience. So what we technically do here is we take many of the contributions that Michelle has done to the cross-cultural psychology sphere, and we sort of introduce that to the experimental economics space and try to understand some of the mechanisms that she has established in cross-cultural correlational work. All right, so to set the stage, I'm sure I don't have to convince anybody here that social norms matter and social norms are important to influence behavior. But the question is, how do we understand the influence of social norms on behavior? The standard approach in existing literature that many of you, even in this audience, have contributed to is to usually take snippets of information about an underlying reference group, often the mode or the mean of a certain group, and provide that information to participants and then sort of measure the responsiveness to that information. But this, of course, neglects the important issue of distributions of behavior, right? You can have the same mean, but the underlying distributions can look very different. And that's exactly what Michelle has sort of established in her important science paper, and then follow-up work has established that too. And so you can think of these different forms, for example, in this context, and that's the way we'll think about this, is you can have the same mean of certain behaviors, but you can have a very tight norm that is sort of centered around a certain behavior. You can have the same mean, but you have a very loose norm where it's not even clear what exactly is the typical behavior in that environment. And you can have very polarizing norms where you have two opposing behaviors that yield the same average behavior. All right, so now tight and loose norms matter, as Michelle has shown and Michelle and colleagues have shown, because they sort of connect the relationship between underlying distributions of behaviors and sort of how individuals perceive the importance of following behaviors in certain environments, right? And so Michelle has done this across various countries, even within the US. And the way Michelle thinks about tight and loose is tight cultures are characterized by sort of strong social norms that are well-defined, and loose cultures are sort of these weak social norms where the sort of identification of a clear social norm is not clear. All right, so on top of that, and again, many of you have work in this space. Yan has just presented her paper here. Andrea will present her paper right after. By the way, congrats on your R&R. For that paper. Polarization is increasing across sort of many countries, and so we know that, and we measure that, and we do understand that, and we also understand that polarization has detrimental impact on various forms of social preferences, and that's something that I'm studying sort of in my paper, in a separate paper. So it's important that we understand the impact of polarization, but we take sort of a different kind of approach to polarization in this paper that I'm presenting here. I will explain to you that in a second, but first also let me emphasize that polarization and the negative impact of polarization affects also everyday life in terms of businesses and how sort of business is being done and how people interact with each other in companies, and employees can sort of cluster and polarize sort of clusters, and sort of the interaction between those polarizing clusters is affected. And we also know that the social divisiveness that exists, and that's separate work with colleagues from Wharton, we know that this gives rise to the spread of misinformation. All right, so this sort of sets the stage. So what is exactly that we do in this paper? We try to understand how individuals react when confronted with tight, loose, or polarized norms in a strategic environment. All right, so there will be there's a theoretical piece in this paper that I'm not going to dive into, but from a sort of a theoretical point of view, the environment that we create is one that embeds strategic risk. And I will walk you through how we think about strategic risk in a second, but the way you can think about this for now is the more variation there is in observed behavior, the more you are uncertain about the best response, and the more you're uncertain about what's sort of the appropriate rule or norm in a given environment. What we do is we have a well-powered pre-registered experiment that is representative of the US sample. And so what we do here is we sort of isolate different mechanisms by exogenously varying the distributions from which a matched co-player's sort of contribution is wrong. And I will show you what that looks like in the design in a second. And we have a few main results that I'm just going to foreshadow. Loose, tight, and polarized norms are self-sustaining is what we find. I will talk about this in a second, but the way you can think about this as well is that individuals mirror the distributions that they see. And so if they see quite loose distributions and they don't know how to respond, the response is also quite loose. And that has important implications from a sort of a cultural norm sustainability point of view. And we also find that personal values, the values that we as individuals hold about appropriateness of behaviors in general, have a high impact in general, but they have an overly high impact in environments where the norms are not clearly defined. And so the idea here is that if we don't know what to do, we sort of introspect and follow what we think is the right thing to do. And that has important implications from a policy point of view that I will sort of return to at the end. All right, so there's a lot of related literature that many of you have contributed, and I just want to skip that obviously for the sake of time. But of course, there's a lot of work on the impact of norms on individual behavior across strategic and non-strategic settings. There's a lot of work on polarization and how that affects preferences and behavior. And then, of course, a lot of work on tight and loose cultures and how that affects us across different environments. All right. Now, briefly mentioning sort of the theoretical framework and the setup. And if you have more questions, I mean, Sylvia is in the audience, feel free to sort of use the chat and she can help out with that simultaneously as well. The public goods literature has established that reciprocity concerns play a strong role in strategic environments. And as sort of the co-players' contributions are unknown, we face the strategic risk. We need to predict what our matched partners are doing. And so depending on what kind of information you have about the underlying distribution, you might perceive this risk to be different because you learn a different snippet about sort of the norm that might exist in the environment that you operate. And so the question that we sort of ask is, do people care about averages and sort of follow averages and even sort of average out very dispersed distributions, or do they also care about distributions? And that will be sort of the main sort of driver and the sort of the main mechanisms that we'll try to disentangle here. It's important, as I mentioned, from sort of a cultural sustainability point of view, because if only the mean matters and people don't really care too much about sort of the variance of a social norm, then societies will converge eventually, because people will start imitating the mean and will sort of converge to the mean. And then, you know, from in a long-term perspective, the tightness and looseness doesn't really matter because we'll sort of all sort of converge to the same point. We will show that this is not the case, and so we'll establish this causally that this is not the case. We have a little model section in the paper that establishes there are two sort of ways in which you can think about utility functions in our context. One, sort of the quadratic loss function that establishes that only mean matters and people sort of average out the behaviors that they see, and they care mostly about sort of the quadratic difference of the contributions. An alternative way of thinking about this is sort of in line with this Fair-Schmidt type of thinking, is linear loss functions, where you care both about the means and the variance about distributions. All right. So here's the experimental design. It's in a way quite simple because we have two stages that mirror each other. The first stage, part one, is done without providing any information about underlying social norms or any distributions. And part two is the same type of elicitation of behaviors and beliefs, but now we give them some information about underlying distribution. Okay, participants know the two parts. Participants do not know the details of the second part until they reach the second part. So the way we do that is we use a variant of the public goods game that was most closely related to the Nature Human Behavior paper by JiaBin and colleagues, which is called the ABC of cooperation approach. The advantage of the ABC of cooperation approach is that it disentangles the different aspects of strategic behavior because it allows us to think about beliefs, attitudes, and contributions in separate ways. A standard public goods game usually sort of conflates these, and you sort of just study behavior over time, we'll be able to disentangle those in our paper. Participants, when they enter part one, do one of two things at random. So there's a random ordering. Either we first elicit their behaviors and beliefs related to the public goods game, or we elicit their norms. All right, so one of these two things happen at random, and then sort of in random order, but they do both things. And so when they play the ABC of cooperation game, the first task is always eliciting effective cooperation in a public goods game. It's a two-player, one-shot contribution that you decide to do towards a participant, and then we sort of multiply. It's a typical public goods game. There are incentives for you to free ride, but there's a collective sort of action problem and so on. The second task is eliciting incentivized beliefs about the partner's cooperation. We ask to predict what you believe your partner will do, and then we pay you accordingly if you match that behavior. And then the third task is measuring the attitudes towards cooperation. This is sort of the standard approach of using a strategy method and allows us to classify participants into conditional cooperators, free riders, and so on, right? So we sort of use the structure to elicit types. All right, so in the second part, the second sort of part of the first part of this experiment, we then elicit norms, and we follow the existing literature closely related to Christina Bicchieri's work. We elicit three types of norm-related information and beliefs. One is the personal values. We ask people what they believe is the right behavior in this game. We ask them to predict what they think other people will do in this game, and we ask them to tell us the normative expectation, which is what they think other people will say is the right thing to do, right? So normative expectations are second-order beliefs about other people's personal values. All right, so this is done, and then they move on to the second part, and now we show them one of 6 distributions at random, and these distributions are our treatments. They only see one, and they vary according to means and variance. So we vary whether participants see a high mean or low mean, or they see low variance or high variance, and even a U-shaped distribution that is our polarization sort of type of distribution. Okay, they see only one of them, and after they see that distribution, we then play again the public goods game, and we again ask them to predict the norm information, right? So these two things are the same as here, but now it's preceded by the distributions, and then in the end we sort of pick one of them at random. All right. So here's just a little summary that here are the values in the way that we choose. For the high mean, we always sort of, I mean, obviously we keep one thing the same, and then we vary sort of the other ones. For the low variance, we have a variance that is smaller than in the high variance condition, and between low and high mean, we sort of have these means. In the U-shaped distribution, we have sort of the highest variance, because that's the highest dispersion of behavior. All right, we call them single peak, double peak, and again, they only see one of these distributions. All right, so then briefly, because I want to get to the results, we really just play the standard public goods game. You have 2 players, they get some tokens, they can contribute to the public good, and now we play this ABC of corporation method. They first are asked to contribute and how much they want to contribute, then we elicit their beliefs about the partner's contribution, then we ask them about their attitudes, and then allows us to classify participants. All right. I mentioned this. These are the 3 types of norms that's all standard. And then the way we sort of elicit the norms is sort of a new way, something that I thought of, but I have not yet written up. So here's a commitment to me to write up that paper. It's sort of a new way of thinking about eliciting norms that is not dependent on giving modes and means, but giving us a little bit more information about distributions and introducing incentive compatible ways of eliciting a distribution of a norm as opposed to eliciting a point estimate of a norm. All right. But yeah, I'm not going to talk about this here, and I want to show you sort of the results instead. But this is the advantage that we sort of see, is because it allows us to capture nuances in the norms as opposed to just asking about, let's say, the mode, which completely neglects whether sort of the second highest behavior would be close to it or very far away, right? And so those existing norm elicitation techniques don't allow you to distinguish and sort of capture that. Okay, great. All right, so first of all, here are the results from the baseline. So this is sort of the stage 1 type of elicitation. What we find is that participants contribute 2.6 out of sort of the 4 tokens that we give them, and they state a personal value of 2.9. So they don't even think you should contribute all of the money to in this game. And we are able, based on the elicitation techniques that I just showed you, we're able to classify participants. And 84% of them can be classified as conditional cooperators, which is in line with the existing literature. Now, what's important here is for you to sort of notice this quite dispersed distribution of the beliefs about what you think the other player will do, about what you think other people say one should do, and so on. And so we find that there's a high dispersion, which gives us an indication that there's no real clearly established norm in this setting, a public goods scheme setting that we study, right? And that's important to understand, which is great, because if it's not really established, there's sort of an inherent uncertainty that we can play with as we provide the different information across the treatments, right? If we use a game that has a very clearly established norm, it would be much more difficult to sort of shift them. And we have work that has established that for settings where the norms are already quite clearly defined from the beginning. All right. So, okay, so this is just a baseline observation. So let's talk about the results. So the first set of results is about that. Oh, let me just move. I don't see the screen here. All right. that sort of the effect of high and low mean, of seeing high and low mean sort of distributions and across treatments. So whether we pool the data or whether we break it up according to low and high variance and U-shape, what we find consistently is that participants respond to high mean more in contributions. They contribute subsequently more when they see a high mean distribution as opposed to when they see a low mean distribution, right? And that's in line with existing literature. But what's nice here is that we actually show that people quite strongly follow this high mean, although it goes sort of against the self-interest, because the self-interest would be to free riding. And so we see that the difference are not different here, but what we find is across the different treatments is that the high mean observation always yields a higher contribution in part 2. All right, so this is the first sort of result that is good to establish. The more interesting type of result is to understand how the shapes of the different distributions affect the shapes of the subsequent behaviors, right? So do people mirror tight and loose distributions, or do they just sort of converge to averages? And what we actually find is that participants mirror the distributions quite well. So we find that looser norms generate a higher variance in individual responses. And when norms are polarized, so if you look at sort of the more polarizing, if you think about the more polarizing norms in the U-shaped distributions, you see also U-shaped response in their behaviors, right? And so you see that in high and low means, and you also find that in a high variance condition, we have more variance than what we have in low variance condition, right? So that's great. So that establishes that the utility function probably looks closer to like a linear kink function, and people really sort of care about both means and distributions. All right, and so yeah, so we have tests that show that the distributions are significantly different. The third set of result is to think about changes, right? So now I just give you sort of a direct comparison between how conditional when people started, where people started in the first part before seeing any information, how does behavior sort of change in the second part, right? And what you can sort of see again is a somewhat sort of consistent pattern. We see that across different conditions, people are sensitive to what they see, and we see that sort of, let's say, in a high variance condition, between low and high mean, we see that sort of the distributions, the tails, they sort of shift in the direction of what they see, right? And so we can sort of establish that behavior is somewhat sensitive across these different environments. Okay, so this is about changes in behavior. We can also talk about changes in normative beliefs, right? So we asked participants what they think, and then we asked them again what they sort of think again. But now here we are predicting what they believe other people will say, right? It's not about them telling us what they believe about themselves. It's about how they believe other people might change their perception of norms. And what we find here is, again, that as we go from, let's say, low mean to high mean, the perceptions changes. The way you can interpret these sort of bars here is if the value is positive, that means a particular set of behavior contributing 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 tokens to the public good has become more socially appropriate. And if the value is negative, that means you think that other people will believe that this behavior will be less socially appropriate. And what we find is that as participants observe high mean distributions, they think that sort of high mean behavior will be more appropriate as opposed to the low mean distributions that they see, what they believe low mean behavior will be more appropriate, right? And so we can sort of see that. And we interestingly, again, when we elicit these normative expectations, we also find in the U-shaped distribution that also the change in the normative expectation is sort of U-shaped, right? You find this interesting U-shape. So you believe that other people will change their opinion in a U-shaped way as well. You think some other people will now believe that giving nothing is more appropriate. Or that giving everything is more appropriate, right? But giving something in the middle, giving just half of it, is definitely super inappropriate, right? And so that's interesting, again, right? So they're mirroring these distributions, and if they see high mean behavior, they think that behavior will be more appreciated by the society. And if they see polarized behavior, they think the society will appreciate polarized behavior. Now, lastly, is sort of just a quick sort of regression to show you some of our sort of secondary results, which is we know that personal values always play a role, right? People follow their heart and they follow what they believe is the right thing to do, but they do that even more so in environments that are characterized by high variance or U-shaped, right? And so the more strategically uncertain the environment is, the more important your personal values become, right? So this is sort of the difference in different type of behavior. All right, so I'm running out of time, so I just want to conclude here. So I'm glad I'm in time in a way. there's more to the paper, right? I'm just showing you a snippet of these things, but what we really try to establish is a causal relationship between how do different perceptions of tightness and looseness of norms change people's behaviors and people's own perceptions of social norms. And we do that by varying these different aspects of distributions. And we find that relative looseness and tightness of norms, as well as their shape, matter. And so that has these direct implications. And one of them is also that when we operate in loose environments, it seems to be more fruitful to target personal values, to really try to tell people, they should be changing their behavior because they're following their personal values more. But if we're in very tight environments and people are sort of more sensitive to what they observe happening around them, then it might be more fruitful to use norm nudges that emphasize the behavior of the surrounding reference groups, right? And so that is, he says, sort of the two different implications. All right, so I would like to close here. Thanks so much. And Laura, I'm looking forward to your comments.
Awesome. Let me just share my screen real quick. I have a few slides, not too many, I promise. Everyone see them okay? Hear me okay? Awesome. Well, thank you, Eugene. And so I really enjoyed reading the paper. I really enjoyed seeing the talk as well, since I read the paper a few weeks ago. So it was nice to sort of get used to it again. So, maybe just starting out, instead of just summarizing what you just told us all, I'd like to think kind of more broadly, like, why should we care about this paper? And I think there are some really good reasons. So, we want to induce certain behaviors that we don't see enough of sometimes, things like donations, reduced energy use, COVID mitigation strategies, et cetera. So, it's really important to think about the tools that policymakers and practitioners have to induce behaviors that we're not seeing enough of. And something I think that all of the people in this room already know is that showing norms can impact those behaviors. But we haven't unpacked exactly how we show those norms matters. And something that we've seen a lot of is the mean shown changes things, but what we haven't explored as much is the distribution. And I think that's really, just an important thing that hasn't been unpacked so far. So this paper, really, we should care about it because it's one of the first that I've seen about thinking about how the distribution matters to inducing behaviors. And in particular, it tests kind of two of the main models we have in social preferences to think about sort of inequality aversion, which are the quadratic model and the linear kink model, which I teach in my own behavioral economics class at the end of the semester. And it's a great sort of, horse race to see between the two things. So in summary, you're using experiments of 1,200 people that you ran in December 2021, I believe. Is that a typo? How did you do this? I don't know how you are presenting data from a paper that you just gathered data in last month, and you sent me the paper in December. So typo, miracle, whatever.
No typo, no typo.
So yeah, very impressive that was all done. And what you seem to find is that the mean matters, which we kind of already knew, but so does the distribution, right? And that's new information to me, at least. And also, you did a nice job of just comparing these two kind of really popular models, finding generally, in my opinion, that the linear kink model seemed to be better at finding, predicting behavior than the quadratic loss model, right? And that gives us, something to use when we're thinking about how to predict what behaviors are going to go out, take place. So I have a few comments, okay? Sort of broad comments. So comment number one is, it's great to know that the distribution affects behavior. But then when I was thinking about it, and you talked about this at the end of your presentation, it's like, how would I go about telling people about the distribution? So when I thought about sort of the messaging I see out there about what behaviors are out there, a lot of it's always about the mean. 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this thing, so 90%. Or, if you think about these energy efficiency ones, often it's saying, you use this much, your neighbors use that much. So it's just the mean of what your neighbors did, not the distribution of what your neighbors do. So I was struggling to think about how can we implement showing the distribution in a way that people will see it and understand it and take it in, right? And I know how you did it in your experiment, and I think that worked in that setting, but I don't know how it would work in the wild, right? A second comment is showing a polarized distribution leads to more polarized actions. And it sort of made me think, and I think you spoke about this at the very end of your talk, about like, maybe there are situations where that would be desirable and ones where that would be undesirable. And so we could actually change which information we show depending on what our desired outcomes are. So maybe we don't want to show how polarized the world is for something like vaccine take-up, for instance, but perhaps we do want to show the distribution for something of donations, where we actually maybe do want to induce, that same thing in the real world, where I assume there's very many small ones and very few large ones, but that would be fine to see as a practitioner to get those types of donations. And I honestly don't have a prior on what we would prefer for energy usage. I'm not sure if we want, to show the polarized or non. So, and then my last and final comment is that there's a large debate in behavioral economics about the right model, I think, for time preferences and risk preferences, right? We see people debating those things kind of hotly on a regular basis. But there's considerably less discussion, I think, on the right model for social preferences about inequality. And I've always found this a little puzzling because, especially in the last, I'd say, 5 years, inequality has become such an important thing in the mindsets of the world at large. I think most of us probably work at an institution that now has a, DEIJ, inequality committee and provost and dean, all these things. You don't see people talking about which model works best for seeing how people feel about inequality in the same way. So when I saw your paper and it had this horse race between the two kind of models, the linear kink and the quadratic, I thought to myself, like, I think I know of only under one paper that does like this exact sort of thing where it kind of puts these two models next to each other, which is this older paper by Engelman and Strobel. And so I think this is a huge contribution, honestly. I'd like to see more people sort of showing us which of these models works better at predicting behavior. And, even more so, I'd love to see some more of them out in the field as well. And I think that it might actually bring more, interest broadly to the social preferences, understanding social preferences and economics within the field as well as outside the field. So I think that's me at 5 minutes. And so some questions for discussion when we have that at the end is how might we communicate about distribution? When might we want the mean versus the distribution to be shown? And last, do others agree that if we thought more about what the right model was for social preferences, would it broaden interest in social preferences? So we'll stop there.
Okay, can everyone see my slides okay? All right, great, thanks. So today I'm going to be talking about a project with my colleague Peter Matthews, looking at whether the partisan composition of a group affects its members' ability to work together to accomplish some shared apolitical goal. So the last 4 decades in American politics have been characterized by increasing dislike and distrust between rank and file Democrats and Republicans. And this so-called affective polarization is largely distinct from ideological or issue-based polarization. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call, so that's a bit distracting. So for instance, these data are from the feeling thermometer questions on the American National Election Study, which since 1978 has asked respondents to rate their warmth toward each party on a thermometer from 0 to 100 degrees. So the green line here shows their warmth toward their own party. The blue line shows the warmth toward the opposing party, and the difference is given by the orange line, which provides a measure of polarization in affect, the difference in how much people like their party versus the other party. So we can see that this gap has gone from less than 25 degrees in the late 70s to cracking 50 degrees for the first time in 2020. Perhaps more extreme, a substantial minority in both parties say that they see the other side as a threat to the nation's well-being. And roughly half think of the other party not as political opponents, but as enemies. And furthermore, this animosity extends beyond simple expressions of dislike on surveys and into everyday interactions outside of the political realm. So experiments have consistently found, first of all, that partisans are more generous toward members of their in-group than their out-group. They give more money in dictator and trust games. They're willing to work for a lower wage when the employer shares their affiliation, and they prefer to give scholarships, college admission, and discounts to co-partisans. And second, people would rather associate with co-partisans than opposing partisans. They're less likely to interview job applicants whose resumes suggest they belong to the other party, less likely to choose opposing partisans for a work team, even if they're more skilled, and they're more likely to pursue romantic partners who share their affiliation. So this literature is obviously vast, and this talk is short, but there are a few points that I want to highlight as particularly relevant for this study. So first, to the extent that people treat members of the two parties differently, sometimes it's due to treating co-partisans more favorably than someone whose affiliation is unknown. Sometimes it's due to treating opposing partisans worse, and sometimes it's ambiguous. Second, these papers tend to look at one-shot decisions rather than repeated interactions. And so the question remains whether teams of mixed partisans who must work together in ongoing, everyday interactions are able to overcome this animosity and sustain cooperation. And third, this is a potentially important distinction because there's evidence that a major hurdle to cooperation is that partisans have very pessimistic beliefs regarding the other side's willingness to cooperate. So as much as people may dislike each other, they believe that the other side dislikes them even more. And Eugene has a paper in which he elicits beliefs in conditional cooperation schedule in a one-shot two-player public goods game. And he finds that people are just as willing to cooperate with members of both parties, conditional on knowing the other person's cooperation. But the problem is that they believe opposing partisans won't cooperate with them. So this is all to say that it is still unclear what affective polarization means for groups that interact repeatedly, where members can update their beliefs about the behavior of others and potentially punish those who are uncooperative. And so in this paper, we ask, have we actually reached the point where Democrats and Republicans can no longer work together to achieve common objectives in everyday apolitical interactions? Or are groups of mixed partisans who interact repeatedly able to self-regulate, perhaps with the help of an enforcement mechanism? So to address this, we use the standard framework for studying group cooperation in the lab, which is the repeated linear public goods game. In the version that we use, players are matched into groups of 3, and these groups remain fixed for the full experiment, which is 10 periods. In each period, each person is given 20 experimental dollars, and they can decide to contribute any part of it to a group account. Everything in the group account is then doubled and divided equally between the 3 group members. So each person's payoff for the period is simply the 20 they started with, minus whatever they contributed, plus total contributions made by everyone times 2 divided by 3. So this game is nice because the incentives are pretty clear. So if your objective is purely to maximize your own payoff, then you think, well, every dollar that I keep is a dollar that I keep, whereas every dollar I contribute gets lumped in with everybody else's contributions, multiplied by 2, divided by 3, and comes back to me as 67 cents. So that's not a very good deal. We have a dominant strategy to contribute nothing. However, if the objective is to maximize the payoffs of a group as a whole, then you would think every dollar I keep benefits me by $1, but only me, whereas every dollar I contribute benefits me by 67 cents, and each of the other 2 group members by 67 cents also, for a total increase of $2. So contributing everything maximizes the total group payoff. So if everyone keeps everything, then each person earns 20. If everyone contributes everything, each person earns 40. But of course, they can only achieve this if they overcome the individual incentive to free ride. So one particularly successful means by which groups can enforce cooperation is through peer punishment. And so in our experiment, we give half of the groups access to a punishment mechanism in which they can pay to reduce the earnings of one or both group members. In doing so, we use the setup by Gechter, Renner, and Zefton in their 2008 science paper, which has become pretty much standard. So after seeing the contributions by each of the group members and learning their earnings thus far for the period, players can assign up to 5 deduction points to each of the other group members. Each deduction point that you give reduces your own earnings by 1 and reduces the earnings of the person receiving it by 3. In the event that somebody would earn negative earnings for the period, we simply reduce their earnings to 0 instead. However, they do still need to pay for any punishment that they doled out. So it is, in theory, possible to earn a negative payoff by punishing someone and being punished in return. So putting that all together, each person's final payoff for the period is just what we had before, minus 3 times the number of points they received. In the event that this is negative, we zero it out, and then we subtract off the price of points received. So overall, we used a 2x2 design in which we independently varied, first, whether people have access to this costly punishment mechanism, and second, whether participants knew the party affiliation of their group members. We had 456 American political partisans participate in the experiment, which we conducted on MTurk in the days leading up to the 2020 US elections. And the timing is worth emphasizing here, since there's evidence that citizens identify more closely with their political party as elections approach. And so this provides a particularly strong test of whether cooperation can be sustained. So in order to recruit specifically political partisans who were attentive to the experiment and the instructions, we took the following procedure. So first, we invited people to complete a very short initial survey for a small payment, knowing that some of them would be invited to participate in the slightly longer experiment. We recruited through Cloud Research's platform, and we filtered out anyone who failed their intention checks or didn't have a high task completion rate. Then we had them pass through our own battery of 4 attention checks, and we bumped out anyone who failed any of those, including capture questions. Then they completed that short initial survey, which took less than a minute. Anyone who did not identify as a Democrat or Republican or said that they were not a US citizen was paid for their participation in the survey, and that was the end. The others were shown the instructions for the baseline public goods game without punishments, and they answered some questions about the instructions, which they had to answer correctly in order to proceed. So people who answered all of those questions correctly were then bumped into the main experiment, which was in O-Tree. At that time, they were matched into a group of 3 and assigned a treatment. So it's important to note that we didn't assign people to treatments until this full screening process took place. So we didn't differentially screen people out of treatments where the instructions were more complicated. Then at that point, they saw any additional instructions for their treatment and they played the game. So to start, they saw information about their group. For those in the condition without political affiliations, that looked like this. They just learned that everyone's going to be given a label, A, B, or C, which stays the same for the duration of the experiment, and they find out their own label. For those in the partisan condition, they see the affiliation of each person as well. And this is the reason why we kept those labels constant for the duration of the experiment, because if you were, say, participant B in this version, you would be able to identify A and C simply by their label. Whereas if you were, say, participant A, you wouldn't be able to identify B and C since they were both Democrats. And so we wanted to make sure that that was constant across treatments and across partisan compositions. So then people make their contribution for the period. They find out their own earnings and total contributions. And then they also see this broken down by what each person did. So in the no punishment condition, they just see this information and click, they can't make a decision. In the punishment condition, they decide how many punishment points to assign to the other people. And so this is obviously for the political affiliation treatment. In the other treatment where they don't see affiliations, everything is the same, we just don't have these labels listed. Then finally, after each period, they see the total earnings after all the punishments have been doled out. After 10 periods of this, they are paid a flat rate of $2 for their participation, plus a penny for each experimental dollar earned in the experiment, which is actually the same conversion rate used in the Gechter et al. Lab experiment, except that was in British pounds. So the total earnings were over $5. It took about 5 to 7 minutes. So these were pretty good payments for MTurk standards. All right, so now let's look at the results. I'll start by showing you the graphs of contributions over time and then turn to the regression results. So to begin, let's look at contributions in groups without a punishment mechanism. So the orange circles here will show contribution trend in mixed groups, so 2 Democrats and a Republican or 2 Republicans and a Democrat. The blue squares will show single party groups of all Democrats or all Republicans. So we can see that a significant difference arises in the very first period and grows somewhat over time. By the second half of the game, contributions in single party groups are about 43% greater than those in mixed party groups. And overall, if we treat each group across all 10 periods as a single observation, the difference is significant at less than the 0.01 level. And the first period is already significant at the 0.015 level. So is this due to people contributing more when they're in a group of all co-partisans, or contributing less when they know that there are opposing partisans in their midst? So to look at this, we could see the contributions in groups where affiliations are not known. And in this case, we see that contributions are very similar to the mixed party groups, both in level and in the significant decline over time. So the difference seems to be due to a positive benefit of being in a homogeneous group. So now let's look at the punishment condition. So here we see that when groups have access to an enforcement mechanism, single party groups no longer experience an advantage. There's no significant difference across group compositions when members can punish each other. So our results seem to indicate that single party groups achieve higher cooperation, but only in the absence of punishment opportunities, suggesting that partisan homogeneity is a substitute for an enforcement mechanism. In contrast, even polarized groups are able to achieve similarly high cooperation levels when they can punish free riding. And these findings are confirmed by the regression results. So in this first column, we regress total group contributions on indicators for being in a multi-party group and a single party group, with the nonpartisan groups as the omitted condition, and an indicator for being in the punishment condition, as well as its interactions. And so we see first that without punishment, single party groups contribute about 15 experimental dollars more per period. While punishment generally increases contributions, the positive effect of homogeneity is wiped out when punishment is available, as indicated by the nearly equal and offsetting coefficients on single party and single party crossed with punishment. This next column interacts period with our treatment variables and reveals how the treatments affect contributions over time. So in the omitted conditions, we see that contributions decline by nearly 2 units per period. And this decline is significantly ameliorated when either punishment is available or members belong to the same party. And then finally, the significant negative coefficient on the interaction demonstrates that the two effects are substitutes and that punishment is beneficial in moderating the decline in contributions only in the nonpartisan and multi-party groups where there was a significant decline to begin with. Right, so now let's turn to punishment behavior. So here we estimate a 2-limit Tobit model where the dependent variable is the number of punishment points that one player assigns another. And the independent variables are how much the target of that punishment contributed in the period, how much the other 2 people in the group contributed, whether the person making the punishment decision is a Republican, and their relationship to the person who is receiving the punishments, whether they're a co-partisan or an opposing partisan. So the difference between these 2 columns is that the second only includes observations where the target contributed less than their full endowment. So we're excluding antisocial punishment. So first we see that how much punishment someone incurs is negatively associated with their contribution and positively associated with the contributions of the other 2 guys. Across all specifications, Republicans generally tend to punish more, but it's Democrats who tend to be more responsive to the affiliation of their target. So controlling for the contribution of the target, Democrats punish Republicans more than they punish co-partisans or those of unknown affiliation. And this can be seen a bit more clearly by plotting the marginal effects of this model. So this shows the marginal effect of the target being an opposing partisan on the likelihood that they are punished for each contribution that they can make. So the blue line shows the effect for punishers who are Democrats, the red for Republicans. So here we see that Democrats are significantly more likely to punish opposing partisans. The effect is significantly greater than 0 for most contribution levels, whereas Republicans' punishment doesn't seem to respond to partisanship. We also see a similar pattern when we look at the level of punishment that the target incurs conditional on being punished. So Democrats who are punishing someone assign more points if that person is an opposing partisan. As far as how people respond to being punished, we have the full regression table for this analysis in the paper, which is online, but I'll just briefly describe it. People generally increase their contributions in the next period if they were punished in the previous period, but they respond less when they are in a mixed group. So the effect of being in a mixed group with punishment is basically a wash. Democrats are more eager to use the punishment against Republicans, but it's also somewhat less effective at increasing contributions. So we've seen that homogeneity and punishment can both enable groups to sustain higher levels of cooperation. And so perhaps a natural question is whether it is just as good to be in a mixed party group with punishment as a single party group without punishment. So to assess this, we can look at the overall efficiency in each condition, where efficiency is measured as the group earnings as a percentage of the way from the dominant strategy outcome where no one contributes anything, that would be efficiency 0, to the fully efficient outcome where everyone contributes everything. So here we see that efficiency in single party groups without punishment is significantly higher than in any other condition. So even if punishment increases contributions, it's costly for both parties, and so it's associated with an efficiency loss. So the single party groups that are able to sustain cooperation even without punishment have an advantage. Their efficiency is about 20 percentage points higher than what mixed party groups can achieve even with punishment. So to conclude, we contributed a controlled experimental test of whether teams of mixed partisans who must work together in everyday interactions are able to overcome this affective polarization and sustain cooperation to accomplish a shared goal. We find that groups whose members share a common affiliation achieve significantly higher contributions and higher welfare than politically polarized groups. Yet our findings maybe are not quite as dire as could have been anticipated in at least two respects. So first, contributions in politically polarized groups are similar in magnitude and time trend to contributions in groups where people don't know the political affiliations of their group members. So in other words, relative to knowing nothing about one's group members, our result is due to members cooperating more with known co-partisans rather than cooperating less with known opposing partisans. And second, when groups can enforce cooperation through costly punishment, we find that mixed party groups are just as capable of sustaining cooperation as single party groups. In this case, single party groups lose their advantage, indicating that political homogeneity and punishment serve as substitutes. But they are imperfect substitutes in the sense that groups who enforce cooperation through punishment achieve lower total payoffs than single party groups without punishment. And finally, to tie this back to the previous work showing that people prefer to form teams with co-partisans, our findings suggest that there could be an efficiency-based motive for this phenomenon beyond any direct benefit from associating with like-minded individuals, since partisan sorting into homogeneous groups could enable them to sustain cooperation without the welfare loss of relying on sanctioning. So understanding this potential motive for partisan sorting is a topic that we hope to explore in future work. Thank you.
Okay, I guess it's my turn.
Yep.
Great. Okay, I have some slides. Let me see if they share appropriately. How's that? Does that look okay? Y'all will let me know if it doesn't.
We don't see them yet.
You don't see them at all?
Nope.
Oh, golly. Well, thank you for telling me. Let's try again.
There we go.
And now,
Yep.
and that's correct.
Looks good.
All right, thank you so much. So I just have a few comments on this paper. First, I want to say thanks to Andrea for this crystal clear paper and her very nice presentation of it, and also for organizing this extremely timely session for the ASSA meetings. All the papers so far have been really fascinating. Thank you all for them. I know that I don't need to summarize what Andrea just said, but that's what I do. So we want to know if polarization, in particular political polarization, interferes with public goods production. Using a standard public good lab experiment, well, lab, except that we're using mTurkey subjects. And the design is very clean. A group of self-identified groups consist of self-identified Republicans, Democrats, mixed groups, or neutral. And the result is that homogeneous groups contribute more than mixed groups or neutral groups. And that punishment makes all the groups the same, which is quite reassuring. Anyway, interesting. So to me, the contribution of this paper is that it shows it shows that cooperation can work. It's a great illustration of how lab experiments can be used to tease out effects that you can't really get at using observational data. It's nice to see this one designed and executed so clearly. So when I think about what kind of cooperation this is, though, to me it's like a local level public good where local participants can agree on what a community needs, and party affiliation is less salient. I mean, I don't know if you experienced that in your localities, but that's what it feels like to me. Often when I go in to vote for local politicians, I don't even know what their party affiliation is. So I think that when party affiliation is less salient and everybody agrees on community needs, this may be the kind of situation that we're thinking about here. And so this got me thinking about what connections there might be between this work and other research. There's a lot of work in experimental economics on identity and in-group, out-group discrimination. And I kind of wanted a stronger connection between this political affiliation and other identity roles that people take on. Yan and Gary Charnas have a terrific survey that was out last year in annual reviews on identity research, theory and experiment. And they do have a section in that review on teams, which I think has some interesting stuff in it that's related to what you're finding here. In artificial group experiments, minimal group type experiments, common identity does seem to strengthen contributions. And sorry for the self-serving citation there, but we tried to figure this out some years ago, and I think that Andrea and Peter have made a little more progress on it than we did. But also they survey some studies in naturally occurring groups, and Yan has a paper on really nice paper on how joining a team can affect business productivity. So that's one connection that I think that you could make. And I also remembered a paper in the Journal of Public Econ, which has a similar kind of result that I think that you could link to. They explore also the connection between group heterogeneity and identity. But here it's income heterogeneity, not political ideology. And they found a similar result, which is this kind of trade-off that punishment can offset to the negative effect of heterogeneity in groups, but this is with a different kind of group. And so I think the really critical question for this paper is how politically motivated groups are different from other types of artificial and real groups that we've studied in experimental research. So I had a few thoughts that might open up discussion on this idea. One has to do with, well, I guess groupiness, but how strong group identity is. So in a sense, when we talk about polarization, what we're talking about is a strengthening of group identity with respect to the outgroup. So people are getting stronger and stronger in their identification with their political group, I think. So one interesting thing to do, inspired by Yan's paper in particular that she presented, is look for heterogeneity in the effects by the strength of identity or political groupiness. So that's one thing. Another thing I got to thinking about is when political groups agree or disagree on the value of a specific public good. So as I mentioned before, at the local level, maybe people are more likely to be in a group where they benefit similarly from a particular public good, or they can agree that they benefit similarly from a particular public good. But at the national level, you're more likely to get public goods that benefit one group or another group more intensively. So I thought that it might be interesting to think about setting up an experimental model, a lab experiment, where there's two different public goods and you test for the willingness of one group to support another group's public good in exchange for reciprocal support. Here, I think this might come closer to capturing the idea that one group's success is bad for the other group, and one group might deliberately undermine the success of the other group, which is the kind of stuff we're seeing in Congress these days. Another question that came to mind is whether partisans, so in general, partisans select representatives to make decisions for them. And this might lead to more polarization than if the partisans were making decisions themselves, as they do in your public goods game. So when you have agents making decisions that affect the payoffs of groups outside the decision-making process, that's another way that we might explore polarization in a lab type environment. Anyway, I really enjoyed reading and thinking about the paper, and I think it's really interesting. And one of the ways you can tell it's really interesting is how many other things it made me think about. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Catherine.
Can everybody see my screen? Awesome. So thanks for setting this up. Thank you to Cesar for discussing this. And thanks for all the great papers. This has been a really interesting session. So I'm Michael Taylor. I'm a postdoc at Princeton. I'm going to present my paper on the supply of motivated beliefs. So just to introduce the topic, I'm sure I don't need to convince anybody intentionally attending this session, but disinformation is quite costly, but pretty prevalent in society today. And it's been shown to affect beliefs and behavior about important economic issues, public health behaviors, historical facts, or even the state of democracy in the US today. And this has been especially recently discussed as an important issue on social media, where users are often sending and receiving messages on really hot button issues that are often highly politicized. So it's important to understand the mechanisms underpinning false information in order to better understand how we can combat it. One approach that social media companies like Facebook have taken has essentially been to incentivize users to be rated as truthful. So that is, if users send news that is rated as being misinformation, Facebook will limit their future post visibility as well as their ability to monetize and advertise. These trustworthiness ratings are partly reliant on what other users think of them. So other users' assessments will partly determine the trustworthiness that they give to their users. So you might ask what effects these types of incentives will have, and are there ways in which they can actually backfire? And to understand that, it's important to kind of discuss some of the mechanisms underpinning the supply of false information. So I think there's several categories you can think of. I think some natural ones are, a sender might send a false message because, well, they just don't know the truth and they're sending something they think is true. Or they know the truth, but they want to convince other people to hold a certain belief about the topic they're talking about. Or they have something like expressive preferences, where they just prefer to send something for its own sake, even if it happens to be false. I think these channels are absolutely at play, and definitely at play on political topics on social media. I'm going to spend this talk focusing on a fourth channel, which is that I might send a piece of false information because I think that others are going to believe that that message is truthful. So the natural question is, well, what's going to lead receivers to believe that a piece of news as truthful? Well, it could be that they currently hold beliefs that align with the message they're receiving, or controlling for their current beliefs, they are motivated to hold beliefs for political reasons or other reasons that message is truthful. So if they're motivated to believe a piece of news is true, they may rate the sender as being more truthful. So combining these, this suggests that there are two factors that may lead to more false news. One is senders being incentivized to be perceived as truthful by receivers. And two is that senders believe that receivers are going to engage in motivated reasoning and trust these messages more. So that's exactly what I study in this paper. So I run two large online experiments. I'm going to spend most of the paper talking about the first experiment, just in the interest of time. This is going to be a simple sender-receiver game with social media users who are sending and receiving messages, usually on political topics. Receivers are going to be incentivized to accurately rate the truthfulness of senders, and senders are either going to be incentivized to be rated as truthful by receivers or unincentivized. And the main takeaway is going to be that the senders, when they're incentivized, are going to send more false news if the truth is misaligned with the receiver's current beliefs and their motivated beliefs. And overall, these incentives are going to lead to more false messages chosen exactly because of this condition. And I'm also going to find that receivers seem a bit naive to the effect that these incentives have. And I'll talk about that towards the end. Experiment 2 is going to further identify the role that the particular bias of motivated reasoning plays as the driving channel. And I'm going to do this by using a design I've used in a few past papers that identify motivated reasoning when receivers rate messages from a computer. And I'm going to elicit senders' beliefs about receivers' behavior, as well as kind of mimic the type of results that I see in experiment 1. But again, I probably won't have too much time to talk about it today, but it's a sizable part of the paper. So obviously there's a ton of related literature, both on the growing body of evidence on motivated reasoning, but a little less on how this interacts in sender-receiver settings, especially when incentives are not misaligned, as they won't be here, as well as kind of the literature on higher order belief disagreement, particularly about how biased I am versus others. And it also naturally relates to the cheap talk literature, as well as some of the media bias and fake news work. Okay, so I'm going to do a very brief sketch of the theory. The model I'm going to describe is essentially what I'm running in the first experiment. So pretty simple, one sender, one receiver. Sender learns a binary state of the world from nature. The state is either high or low, theta H or theta L. The sender can send one of two binary messages. The messages either say the state is high or the state is low. So one of these messages is going to be coded as true and one is false. They send a high message in state in the high state, this is a true message. They send the low message in the high state, this is a false message. The receiver's going to observe the message but not the state and assess the probability that they think that this message was truthful. Receivers are going to be incentivized to want to give accurate assessments, so want to correctly assess the probability that the sender's message is truthful. And the senders are going to value one or two things. So they're going to value psychologically being truthful. So this is governed by a parameter tau. This is just a psychological preference. This is consistent with a ton of past evidence that people like telling the truth. And they may also care about the receiver's assessment. So gamma is going to govern how much the sender cares about the receiver's assessment of her, and it's greater than or equal to 0. So that is, the sender receives a payoff for telling the truth, for instance, by sending S and H in state H of gamma A plus tau, and of sending a false message by just gamma A. So in this standard case, there's a very natural equilibrium, which is a Bayes-Nash equilibrium, survives a lot of refinements, is also Pareto optimal, in which the sender always tells the truth, and the receiver always believes that the sender tells the truth. This is a very nice truthful equilibrium. It can go away with motivated reasoning. So if receivers in a very simple model of motivated reasoning, we think, let's say receivers, for instance, are motivated to believe that the state is high. They're going to form posteriors here by trading off the benefit of believing that the state is high with their accuracy incentives. So I've added an extra term, lambda A, or lambda 1 minus A, which corresponds to the benefit that the receiver has for reporting values of A that are corresponding to the high state. So that is for trusting the message more if it says the state is high, and trusting the message less if it says the state is low. So I describe a little more in the paper, but you can imagine a notion of a motivated equilibrium in which the sender and receiver may have different beliefs about the bias that the receiver has. And this may be reflected in higher order beliefs as well. And what's going to happen is the equilibria are going to depend a lot on the incentives that the senders have and the two players' beliefs about the bias. If gamma is really low, or both players don't think there's a lot of bias, there always exists a truthful equilibrium. But if you raise gamma a little bit, and you go to an intermediate level of gamma, then it's going to depend on what the two parties believe about lambda. So in particular, there is a very plausible equilibrium in which the sender thinks that the receiver it has a high level of bias. The receiver thinks that he has a lower level of bias. And both players think that in higher order beliefs that the bias is low. What happens is that you can get the receiver to play a best response to the truthful strategy, but the sender always plays XH instead. And so what's going on here is that by increasing incentives, the sender becomes less truthful, especially in the bad state, but the receiver doesn't change his behavior very much. So I'm going to test exactly these predictions. I'm going to vary gamma and whether the receiver's political motives here are aligned with the true state or the false state. And then I'm going to look at the effects of these two treatment arms on the sender's truthfulness and the receiver's assessments of sender's messages. So now I'm going to talk about a little more in detail about experiment 1, move on to results, and then at the end, talk a little bit about why I think a second experiment was useful to run in this context as well. So subjects are going to be sending and receiving messages on questions like the following. So there's a question about the rate of violent crime for US citizens versus undocumented immigrants, which is data that Texas collects. So it says the felony violent crime rate was 213 per 100,000 US citizens. What do you think the probability is that the rate was greater than 213 or less than 213 for undocumented immigrants? So it's a question where we might think that Democrats and Republicans disagree. They do. We might also think they have different motivated beliefs. So we might think that Democrats are more motivated to believe that the rate is lower. Republicans are more motivated to believe the rate is higher for reasons that are consistent with being motivated to think that your political party's stances are more right on immigration. So I do similar questions on several different political topics. So things like racial discrimination, economic issues like wage growth and unemployment, as well as other things like COVID restrictions, as well as a couple of neutral topics. I'm going to have 3 main treatment arms. So it's actually going to be a 2x3x2 design for the main treatments. So I'm going to, as I mentioned before, I'm going to randomly vary the sender's incentives. So the receiver is always going to be incentivized to correctly assess the truthfulness of the message. Sender is either going to be unincentivized on this question or incentivized based on the receiver's assessment, as in the model. I'm going to also randomly vary the information that the sender has about the receiver and who the sender is matched with. So the sender is going to be assigned within subject to either be matched with a Republican or a Democratic receiver, as well as randomly know or don't know the party of the receiver. Receivers are going to know everything that the sender knows except the true answer to the question, which is they know if the sender is incentivized, and they know if their party is revealed to the sender. I also have both players play a practice round in both roles before they actually know their role in the experiment. And I do this just to ensure that they have familiarity with how the game works in both roles and that they're paying attention because they're doing this before they're assigned a role. So the other thing I do is I vary the question. So I vary the topics, obviously, political or neutral, but I also vary within question whether the truth happens to be aligned with the Republican or the Democratic stance. So what I'm essentially doing here is I'm varying within question whether the sender is matched with a receiver whose party is aligned with the truth or misaligned with the truth, or they don't know. Just a couple extra details. So I run this on Prolific. I recruit 750 people who are regular social media users in the US. The sample's evenly split into Democrats and Republicans, and I split participants evenly into senders and receivers. The sample and main hypotheses are pre-registered. One thing I just want to flag, I don't have time to talk in detail about it, but I make heavy use of the strategy method. So senders and receivers are going to be more indirectly matched. And this is just so senders are not thinking about what the receiver actually sees on his screen when choosing messages. Incentives are going to be, I'm going to use probability points. This is just so I can account for things like risk aversion. So I use a version of a binary scoring rule. And then I have subjects play many rounds of this. They're going to be randomly matched with other participants across rounds. And I'm going to randomize the questions and the question order. Okay, so just jumping in right to the results, the main hypothesis here is that when senders are incentivized to be perceived as truthful, if the receiver's party is misaligned with the truth, controlling for their prior, the sender is going to send more false messages. So what I'm showing you on this graph is on the y-axis, this is the share of senders that send false messages. On the x-axis, this is the receiver's prior that the state is true. And so what we're seeing here is that on the purple line is downward sloping. So as the receiver's prior goes up, the senders send fewer false messages. This makes sense. They're appealing to the receiver's prior. This is when the party is aligned with the false state. Now, if we look at when the party is aligned with the true state, we see a similar downward sloping line, but the line is below the purple line. So that is, for a given receiver prior, the sender is more likely to send a false message if it aligns with the receiver's party than misaligns. This gap is about 7 percentage points on it. And we do see that senders generally like to send truthful messages. So all these lines are below 1/2, which is consistent with past evidence. We can also look at this at the individual level. So this is a CDF plot of the share of false messages chosen over the course of the experiment. They have many choices. So the y-axis is the share of incentivized senders, and the x-axis now is the share of messages chosen that are false. And we see again that the green line is above the purple line. And in particular, we see that not that many senders are never sending false messages, but that there's a consistent difference between when the party is aligned with the truth versus misaligned with the truth. Everything I said is just for incentivized senders. So you can ask, well, does this happen with unincentivized senders? For instance, if senders just like sending messages that the receiver is going to be aligned with the receiver's party, or maybe they think that the receiver is just better at assessing truthful at pro-party messages than anti-party messages. So they're altruistic. So we can run the same exact, I'm going to show the same exact picture with unincentivized senders. And we're going to see that the effects entirely go away. So the purple and green lines are right on top of each other, indicating that there's no treatment effect of party false alignment versus party true alignment. And also the line shift up, which I'll mention again in a couple of slides, which indicates that senders are sending more truthful messages when they're unincentivized than incentivized. I can show this a little more formally with a regression. So I regress an indicator for the false message on the various treatments that I have, where party is aligned with the false message versus other treatments. I control for the prior and have fixed effects at the subject, question, and round level, and cluster subject standard errors at the subject level. And so I have a few different versions. So I compare party false alignment, the party true alignment, or no info about the party, or the neutral topics. And we see generally similar effects. So across the three specifications, the first column is just what we've seen before, a 7.1 percentage point increase in false messages when the party's aligned with the false message. If we run the same specification but restrict to unincentivized senders, we see that the treatment effect really does go right to zero. So the point estimate is almost exactly zero, and it is clearly not significant in any way or another. So as I kind of flagged before, the senders do seem to send more false messages when they're incentivized versus unincentivized. And we can see that in this figure here. So this is just, again, raw data, but I've broken down by the treatment again, and we see that especially in the party false alignment, senders are sending more false messages in the incentivized group versus the unincentivized group. And this gap ends up being about 7.5 percentage points overall, and a bit larger, a little over 10 percentage points in the treatment where we would expect it to occur. There's also some effects of prior, as is consistent with past evidence. I mentioned at the beginning, receivers know everything about senders' treatments. So in particular, they know exactly what the sender's incentives are, and it's just as salient to them as it is to the senders. So we can ask, well, how do receivers change their behavior when senders are incentivized versus unincentivized? So this is these are the treatment effects for senders, as we saw before, both on all political questions and when we restrict to the treatment where we would expect this to play more of a role. And I'm going to show you the treatment effects for receivers in terms of their perceived probability that messages are truthful. And they're really right at zero. So it seems like there is no effect of senders' incentives on receivers' behavior. I think this is pretty suggestive that the receivers don't seem to realize the impact that senders' incentives have in leading them to be less truthful. And I have a survey questions where I see qualitatively identical patterns. I think this is most consistent theoretically, the set of these results with a motivated equilibrium in which senders believe that receivers' bias is high. Receivers believe that receivers' bias is low, but senders and receivers both have higher order beliefs. The other player believes that the bias is low. And so this is exactly what this would be consistent with the results, in that the incentives lead the senders to send more false messages, but don't really lead receivers to trust senders any less than they did before. I think there's a lot of possible explanations for these findings. My preferred explanation is that senders expect receivers to engage in motivated reasoning, distorting how they process the information to favor their political party. You could imagine that this is all working through receivers' priors if senders think receivers' priors are biased. I'm not going to have time to talk about it here, but quantitatively, it seems unlikely that this is going to fully explain results. You would need that senders believe Republicans and Democrats with the same stated prior actually differ in their true priors by almost 30 percentage points. Because of the strategy method, I can rule out some stories of other regarding preferences. In general, the incentives effect can't really explain this, why it only occurs when senders are incentivized versus unincentivized. I think one thing that is harder to rule out is higher order beliefs. So maybe senders believe, receivers believe, senders will distort their messages to favor bad news, to anti-party news. It's possible, and I can't really rule it out with this design. So that's why I run a second experiment, to further identify the channel of motivated reasoning. And I do this by breaking the interaction between senders and receivers. So now I have senders who do not affect receivers' payoffs or messages in any way. So I'm only gonna give the very brief outline of this in the interest of time. Receivers are going to play a motivated reasoning task I've used in past work, where they're assessing the truthfulness of messages that say, from a computer, that say that their prior median belief is too high and the prior median belief is too low. It's an environment in which Bayesians wouldn't update their beliefs at all, but motivated reasoners would. Senders are going to be incentivized or unincentivized as before, but it's going to based on what computer message they essentially bet on. And I use the exact same treatments where I vary the incentives, the topics, and who they're assigned, what person they're assigned with. And I'm not going to go formally through the results, but essentially we see the exact same type of effects in that their overall incentives lead to more false messages chosen, and it's entirely driven by the treatment where the party is misaligned with the truth. The receiver's party is misaligned with the truth. So just to wrap up, senders tend to believe that receivers engage in motivated reasoning. I haven't told you, but I do directly elicit beliefs about this as well. When senders are incentivized to be perceived as truthful, even controlling for priors, receivers' party being misaligned with the truth leads to more false messages. Overall, it seems like these incentives do backfire. So just the last thing I want to say is, so it seems like some environments that increase false news is beliefs about others engaging in motivated reasoning, and incentives to be perceived as truthful in these senses often backfire. There seems to be systematic biases in higher order beliefs. Senders tend to overstate the effect that motivated reasoning has on for receivers. Receivers seem unaware that senders are reacting to these incentives in these ways. So I think just for further work, I think it could be useful to exogenously change senders' incentives in order to not incentivize them to send more false messages, or to change belief. Work in progress, looking at ways to potentially debias receivers that I think seem suggestively promising in debiasing receivers, and then conveying this information to senders may lead to less false messages chosen. All right, thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Excellent, thank you. And I just have first of all, I enjoy every paper, and this last one in particular, I think is an excellent example of how we can use experimental economics to show how incentives can backfire. Things that may work in the blackboard when brought into realistic scenarios may completely backfire. So let me just share my my slides if I can. Let me just I have very short comments. Really, I'm going to focus on the theory. I think the experiment was very clear and very convincing. So this is a binary model in several senses. The sender learns the state of the world that can be high or low, reports to the receiver, and this receiver has to assess the accuracy of the sender. The preferences are extremely clear as well. The sender likes to tell the truth. The sender likes to be considered truthful. And there is some element on which there is imperfect information of motivated beliefs. The receiver prefers to believe the report of high state with some weight, and the weight of this element in the preferences of the receiver is this lambda on which there is incomplete information, and that's kind of the key element of the model. So in the model basically gears around a motivated equilibrium. The main element of the motivated equilibrium is the idea that the sender reasoning goes deeper than the receiver. So they have, so receiver plays a strategy corresponding to common knowledge of this bias lambda, but in fact the sender looks deeper. than the receiver, so can manipulate the receiver. And so that's I mean, when you see a new explanation like this, one starts thinking about what are possible alternative explanations. And I like the last slides. I think they went through this point, but the equilibrium that the motivated equilibrium requires the receiver to play something like a pooling equilibrium strategy that reacts a bit like a mixed strategy equilibrium, and so has some comparative static implications beyond those exploited in the experiment, and some of them may be relatively fragile. A point that kind of stuck in my mind while looking at a point that stuck in my mind by reading the paper was this point that are we always better speakers than listeners? I mean, the subjects are playing both roles first to get acquainted, but then their reasoning goes deeper as speakers and as listeners. And that kind of, I mean, that may be true, but kind of stuck in my mind as something that may need more arguing. Another point was, this is an old discussion in behavioral economics, of course, biases versus mistakes. I'm pretty, I mean, the experiments are pretty convincing, but how would a theory based on mistakes fare against these biases? And that would be useful in terms of estimation, to have some alternative to compare. And the other alternative explanation, I was playing for a while. I wasn't unable to really do it, but I was thinking about Kerr's beliefs as a way to, which is another form of naivete, of naive behavior, as a way to obtain an explanation, or at least to have some overarching theory of naive behavior that includes Kerr's and higher order beliefs. After a while, I started getting convinced more that you can actually subsume Kerr's into higher order belief explanations, and we can talk more on that if you want. And so my main point here, the estimation will be more convincing if alternative models or theories are considered, including just mistakes. How about we compare this with what will happen with mistakes? Of course, the mistake will not do very well to explain why incentive backfired. When we have a theory of biases, question is, why would people have those biases? Why would motivated belief emerge? Are they useful to some extent as a shortcut, like it happens in other scenarios with biases? So are these motivated beliefs, do they have an instrumental origin or not? Maybe to send messages that the receiver likes is a way to signal preferences for further interaction. That's kind of a typical explanation. Or maybe it's just a matter of preference, blue pill versus red pill situation. I don't like to see I just like my fake news, even if they don't help me instrumentally. So there are two possible scenarios, realistically, going beyond the sender-receiver model that we may think about. Conversations in which the flow of information goes in both directions. And in those scenarios, trust may be linked to collective action, like in some of the previous presentations, or news reporting, in which the flow of information is one directional, like in this paper and like in the political economy of media. In those situations, building trust may be linked, to signaling the slant of the media. Maybe we may report news in a biased way because that's useful to establish a relationship with the readers. And let me just talk a little bit about this last point, is how media will react to motivated beliefs. Thinking about the political economy models of media that you referred to at the beginning of the presentation. So what would be the implications for slant? Slant is in models of media, one common way to model the slant is the idea that you cannot represent news in all their complexity. You have to simplify. You go for binary messages, or you go for discrete message spaces. And the way you group different situations, that's called the slant. And the slant can be common knowledge, and that's what happens in some models of media slant, like Chen and Swen, or my own work on media slant. If there are motivated beliefs, then slant may not be common information, and there may be space for manipulation, as it happens in this paper. So the question there is, would these biases be persistent? Would they survive? And the typical mechanisms to deal with them: reputation and competition. That's it. Thank you. Sorry, this is just a few things. I really love the paper, and I really love the session. Thank you.
Great, thank you, everyone, and to our both our speakers and our discussants. I think that the stream might be ending any moment here. So if you are an attendee and you have a question, please feel free to send that by email, but otherwise we'll keep talking as long as they let us. But I know that some people have a session right after this, so.
Thank you for organizing.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea, for organizing.
Thanks, everyone.
For all the
Good job, thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you so much.
yeah.